This is the Happy Families podcast. I'm Dr. Justin Coulson. Every so often a study comes along that creates shockwaves, and a brand new comprehensive 13-year study of 4,000 Australian children taking ADHD medication has reached a conclusion that has stunned researchers. I'm going to find out why next. Stay with us. G'day, this is the Happy Families podcast, real parenting solutions every single day on Australia's most downloaded parenting podcast. We are Justin and Kylie Coulson. Kylie, this study I'm so excited to share. It comes from Deakin University in Melbourne, and I want to give you a quick overview of where we're at. Here's the general rundown. Children medicated for ADHD have a lower quality of life than those with the condition who are unmedicated. This is a brand new study. Deakin University researchers, more than 4,000 children from 4 to 17. The researchers found that those taking ADHD medication, like Ritalin, were struggling compared to children with a diagnosis who were not taking the medication. Direct quote from the lead author, quote, "Those taking ADHD medication in our sample experienced more severe ADHD symptoms, which may have significantly impacted children's functioning."
When I think about children taking medication, specifically medication that alters behaviour, this to me feels more like a management approach to behaviour for the comfort of the adults in the room.
Okay, so that's a really provocative statement. Here's the thing. This is supposedly a shock finding, but we have known for people who are doing proper research in this area, we've known for a couple of decades now that the drugs don't work. Well, let me rephrase. The drugs do work, but they're not actually...
They're just masking the bigger issue.
Correct. They're masking bigger issues. They're masking systemic issues in the environment, issues... Let me give you an example. So the data that we're talking about here tells us the following. This is data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And what it shows is that children aged 12 to 17... prescribed ADHD-related medications has tripled over the last 10 years. We've gone from about 2% of 12 to 17-year-olds to 6.6%.
So how much of this comes down to the fact that if you have a diagnosis, then there is more funding thrown at you in education systems?
You get a lot less funding. If funding and ADHD don't tend to tie together, autism definitely, ADHD not so much. And even that's changing. Funding is constantly, it's just a seesaw, it's a roller coaster, and parents are screaming constantly saying, I had money and it was taken away, or I need more money, or whatever it could be, because funding is such a merry-go-round. And part of the problem is that the diagnoses keep on going up. So in Australia today, around 1 in 20 children has ADHD. 1 in 20. And most are diagnosed somewhere around about the age of 6 or 7, early primary school years. And there is an assumption. In fact, I read a recent article in the Murdoch Press, that said, and this is a direct quote, talking about the study we're discussing here, the finding is at odds with other studies that have discovered that taking ADHD medication is linked to better outcomes for children. That's a big fat lie. And I want to spend a little bit of time in this Doctor's Desk episode talking about why it's a big fat lie. And it's provocative, and it's really hard for people to hear, because when your GP or your pediatrician is telling you, or even your child and adolescent psychiatrist is telling you that the drugs do work, for me to sit here on the podcast and say, well, actually the drugs don't work, it can be really, really tough to hear. So I want to give you some evidence for it, okay? I would say one of the most famous studies on the treatment of ADHD was published back in the turn of the century, around then. I can't remember the exact date. And it's called the MTA study. It's the Multimodal Treatment of Children with ADHD study, the MTA study, Multimodal Treatment of Children with ADHD. And it was a 14-month study. And not only was it 14 months, so it's nice and longitudinal, but it was a multi-location trial. So it's not just a bunch of kids in Brisbane or a bunch of kids in Canberra or a bunch of kids in South Australia. It's right across a whole lot of different locations. We've got 527 children aged 7 to 10. They're randomised to 4 treatment groups. So you've got a medication-only group. You've got a behaviour therapy-only group. You've got a combined medication and behaviour group, and then you've got routine community care, which means that there's not really a whole lot going on. There's just general care for the child. And what the authors found after 14 months of treatment was that there was more reduction of ADHD symptoms in the medication-only group and in the combined medication, and behavior therapy groups than the behavioral therapy only, which obviously, as you would expect in a study like this, did better than the routine community care group. Essentially, they were a control group. But if you do a much more careful reading of this, and I'm sorry to geek out, but this is what is so important about these episodes, a more detailed reading showed that there were some genuine problems with the conclusion that the group reached and that the peer-reviewed paper brought. As an example, 2/3 of the routine community care group were also prescribed stimulants. They were also given drugs. They were just part of the community care. And so the control group wasn't a true control group. They were receiving care from a GP or from whoever the parents could get help from. And 2/3 of them ended up getting drugs during the trial anyway. But they had the poorest outcomes of all. Also, the behavioural treatment group, so they definitely didn't have any drugs, that consisted of an intensive 6-week course, and that could be completed at any time during the 14 months. So by the time of the 14-month evaluation, some of the families receiving that behavioural therapy intervention, they'd completed it maybe 9 months, 10 months before the final assessments, and others had only just done it. Whereas the medication group, they had regular appointments throughout the study period. And so all of this raises the possibility of placebo effects being the main reason for better outcomes of the medication and the combined medication behavior therapy group, because they're having regular reviews through the 14 months versus the other two groups. Anyway, that's a long way of saying there's some really big flaws with what became the most, literally, this became the most quoted study for ADHD treatments. It's been consistently referred to as the gold standard study in treatment guides across a whole lot of countries. But there's so much more to the story. And after the break, I'm going to tell you what the clangor is here and why this shock finding here in Australia with our 7,000 ADHD kids is not such a shock at all. Stay with us. We're back with the Happy Families podcast. So this 14-month MTA study, the gold standard around ADHD and medication, and this belief that giving kids medication because they've got ADHD is really, really interesting. And the reason that I want to share it is as follows. There was a study that was published at the 3-year follow-up of the MTA study. There's a 3-year follow-up, not just the 14-month that I've been talking about. There's a 3-year follow-up study, but nobody wants to know about the 3-year follow-up study that was published. I'm
really curious about this. So you've suggested that, number one, this has become the gold standard in research. Number two, it's been peer-reviewed. And my understanding with research is that peer reviews are there
so
to
this
actually
stuff doesn't fall through the cracks.
Stomp this out.
Exactly. And unfortunately it does. And I think there's a handful of reasons for it. Number one, because a lot of people who are doing reviews are tired and cranky. And so long as they're seeing what they want to see or what they expect to see in the data, they just push it through. They've got their own publication loads and they've got the university teaching loads and they've got their own problems to deal with. And you don't get paid as a peer reviewer. You end up on an editorial board for a journal, or you literally. So when I was an academic, I had a couple of papers sent to me by editors of journals, and they just said, Justin, we know that this is an area of specialty for you. Would you please be a peer reviewer? And so you don't get paid for it. You just get a random email from somebody saying, can you please review this because we think that you're an expert in it? And then you review the paper. And they assume that you know everything that you need to know to effectively review the paper. You usually don't know, although sometimes you do, you usually don't know who the paper's by. But certainly if you do know who it's by, those people tend to skate through a lot easier because they've got the big reputations and nobody wants to offend them. It's a really flawed process. And in all of the fields that are out there, the process is most flawed and has been shown to be really hard to replicate findings in psychology. Like, psychology is a disaster compared to most other areas. And that's, well, there's a handful of reasons that are beyond the scope of our conversation today around that. But check this out. 5 years later, it's 2007 now, and this paper, this 3-year follow-up paper of the original MTA study gets published. And unlike the original one, like I said, that was published in like 1999, 2000, something like that, this one, published now 8 years down the track, which means that we've got 8 years of the mental health industrial complex and the psychopharmaceutical complex just pushing, the pharmaceutical industrial complex pushing drugs out there because they've got this MTA study where everyone's saying it's great. This paper gets hardly any press. No one makes any noise about it. Nothing happens at all. And here's what they find. After 14 months, the participants in that study were then free to choose what they did with their ongoing treatment. So it becomes this naturalistic study, similar to what happens in everyday clinical settings. The 3-year outcomes found no support for continuing superiority of medication regardless of the initial severity of ADHD symptoms. And on top of that, those who were on continuous medication during the 3 years were more likely to experience a deterioration in ADHD symptoms. They had higher rates of delinquency and they were 4 centimeters shorter. They were literally significantly shorter and lighter by 3 kilos than those who didn't take medication. So after 14 months, it looks like medication's working, although there's some big holes in that study. But then at 3 years, the gold standard study of why we're supposed to be medicating our ADHD kids shows that it's not working at all. In fact, the outcomes are worse. Those who continued to take it for treatment of ADHD were not doing any better. They were experiencing more negative effects than those who didn't. So when I see this headline and I see this study that's come out of Deakin saying shock horror, we've got this research showing that ADHD medication leads to lower quality of life for ADHD kids on Ritalin than for their non-drug taking peers. Everyone's shocked by it, but we've had this data now for 20 years. This has been published data for 20 years, and we've got a brand new study here in Australia that is just adding to a growing body of evidence that's saying, can we please stop drugging the kids? Now, I know if you're a parent whose kids are taking the medication and it's made all the difference, I know it's going to sound like I'm just being unfair and I'm being dismissive and I'm being invalidating. That's not what I'm getting at here. What I'm getting at is that the pharmaceutical companies, Big Pharma, and the mental health industrial complex have bought shoddy science, probably paid for shoddy science realistically, and it's affecting our kids. Now we've got a brand new Australian study that is drawing a line in the sand and saying, we've got the data, 4,000 Australian kids, and the ones who are taking the medication are the ones that are worst off. Now it could be, some people would argue, well, no, actually it's the ones who are worse off who are taking the medication. But that's not what study after study are now starting to point to. Here's the take-home message. Don't pull your kids off the drugs just because you've listened to this podcast. But start to read more. Go and look up what's going on with this MTA study and the 3-year follow-up. I'll publish the links to these studies in the show notes. Have a close look at it. Talk to your pediatrician. Talk to your child and adolescent psychologist or psychiatrist. Talk to your GP and figure out if there are other ways that we can do this, because your child doesn't have a problem. Thinking that your child has a problem is often the bigger problem. But if we can work with the challenges that our children are having and say, no, my child is struggling with something rather than my child is a problem, let's work with our children. We can amend and adjust our environments, ideally, in ways that are going to be positive for them and helpful for them. If they're struggling at school, it doesn't mean it's your child. It could be the school environment. Like, schools are not necessarily great places for every child, as we've discovered in our own family. Kyle, you've been really quiet. I've had a lot to say. I've been geeking out on the science. I appreciate that your eyes are still open and that you're still awake. Is there anything that pops into your head as we wrap up this pod that you want to raise?
I think for me, the standout is just reiterating your child is not the problem. They really aren't. And one of the main reasons we pulled our daughter out of school was because she was seen as a problem. And the change that we saw in her when she came home to a safe environment that she felt comfortable in, it's chalk and cheese. Predictability, consistency, and calm plays such a huge part in our children being able to navigate this world.
Okay, heavy conversation. Thanks for listening. Hopefully, I mean, here's the thing. We're not trying to change your mind. We're not trying to convince you that everything that you've been doing and everything you've been told is wrong. The purpose of these conversations is to provoke thinking and to increase intentionality. There's so much value in being willing to rethink your assumptions.
The challenge for the average mum or dad is that we go and see specialists. We go and see people who are experts in their field.
Trusting that they've read the
and we
science.
trust that they know what's best.
Yep.
And we take for granted that they just know what they know.
Yeah, you can feel so helpless.
And
hearing you say that, it's like we've sat there with medical professionals with our own kids and just gone, well, we're not the expert here. We're just trusting you that you've gone deep into the answers so that you can tell us where to go.
And I just think as individuals, we need to recognise that everybody is giving the best information they have with what they have, but they don't have everything.
Yeah, give yourself some grace, give your kids some grace, and potentially even give your GP or your psychologist some grace. But also, if you know something new, investigate it, learn about it, and have the conversation, because it could actually make a change for the better for you.
And I think you got to follow your gut. Like, I honestly, so many times I've sat in rooms with professionals and have just not felt like what they're sharing is best for me or my family.
Yeah, they're getting it wrong. Yeah.
And that's okay. It doesn't make them a bad person, but it's not right for me. And having, I guess, guts to say that. I really appreciate your advice. I think I'm going to go looking elsewhere because this doesn't sit right with me right now.
Yeah, links to the studies are in the show notes. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Mim Hammonds provides additional research, admin and other support. If you'd like more info about how you can guide your children through their tricky situations, especially if you're raising neurodivergent kids, check out The Parenting Revolution. You'll get so much from it. That and a whole lot of other resources are available at happyfamilies.com.au. Oh, and check out my ADHD course, Game Changer, right there.